Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the Game Week 11 cheat sheet. If you've never seen the cheat sheet series before, it's effectively a roundup of almost the price efficiency of every single player in FPL, sorted by position, sorted by price point, and we're looking at the fixtures ahead, not just the next three, but the medium to long term as well, and incorporating any of my sort of tactical insights that I've seen from the games and listening to the pressers, plus also looking at the advanced stats and a lot of the data that we get from models as well, such as Fantasy Football Hub, with their sort of expected points projections and looking at Opta advanced data as well. So if you're interested in having a look at any of that for yourself, gleaning into that data, have a look at the link in bio below for Fantasy Football Hub. I believe there's still a deal for 30% off up until the end of the season. So do have a look at that if you still want to chase your mini leagues and get some crucial rank rises up until the end of the season. The most important thing I would say with FPL, within my experience too, is that a lot of people will probably look at their team every week and think that their team is very good, and the outcomes don't exactly pan out the way that they want. And I feel like that's been my experience for FPL at the start of the season, but I've just had a massive green arrow and I feel a lot more comfortable, because sometimes you just want to see the outcomes of your decisions. For a lot of people, this might have been a bad game week, and I've been looking at a lot of good teams that have had multiple blanks, and that's just the reality of FPL. It's very tough to get it right every single week. That's why we make decisions on players and we try to own them for a run of games, because it's a lot easier to predict, I guess, how a quality player can produce over a set of games as opposed to a one game sample. So that's just one thing I just wanted to mention this week, especially when it comes to a lot of players. We had some very, very crazy outcomes as well, like Dominic Solanke's 16 points, and a lot of key blanks as well, like Haaland, for example, missing a sitter, things like that. And that happens every time in football, and I think we just need to remind ourselves of that. So starting the midfield position, we have Semenyo rising to the top. There is still, of course, the sort of suspension threat around Semenyo, which is why the asterisk is there. But for the most part, he is very clearly the best player right now, with the fixture swing firmly now in Bournemouth's favor. I just think this is a great run of games to own Semenyo. Do I still think he's better than Rodgers? I do. And partially it comes down to Rodgers' fixtures are still quite tough, and you need Rodgers to be rotated a bit more. Whereas when I look at someone like Semenyo, he's actually someone that doesn't really need any rotation whatsoever. He's someone that I think you can very comfortably play every single week, and that's how strong he is as a pick. The underlying data is very, very good. He's comfortably the strongest out of the 5.x's, and his minutes have been super strong as well. So that's Semenyo for you. Jorginho has also joined the cheat sheet. A lot of people will probably mention João Pedro's coming back, he's in training, and Minte, in theory, could come back to this Brighton team. The way his minutes will be impacted is simply, Jorginho can play on the right wing position when Minte is out. He can play in the 10, as he has been in a couple of games. And he can even arguably play center forward, just looking at what he's done previously in Leeds. Now, Welbeck has quite clearly locked down that striker position. The 10 spot, I do think, can go back to João Pedro, but generally speaking, Jorginho is still an interesting pick for me with Minte being out, and also his performances being really, really good. His pressing is also really, really key for the team. So I think that really should enable him to get minutes in the future. I would continue to actually look at someone like him, where if by game week 12, you don't have good updates on Minte, or even João Pedro is, for example, taking a little bit of time to sort of settle into the team, I think I'd be quite comfortable with his minutes. But I do think he is someone who's a little bit riskier here in terms of minutes. Smith Rowe actually had a great chance within the Brentford match. I still think he's a very, very strong pick. As the fixtures are quite good in the short term, this is, I would say, probably the end of the Smith Rowe run, and then the fixtures get a little bit tougher after game week 13 and beyond. As far as McNeil and Buonanotte, they do drop because the fixtures are getting worse for Buonanotte, and for McNeil, I do think, once again, going back to the underlying data, it's not exactly great, and there's also been calls about, people wanting to see him change his position in the team. And I do think that with a little bit more depth, Everton can, of course, sort of replace his minutes at times, particularly in that sort of 10 position. So McNeil is still a decent pick, and I think he's quite an easy and comfortable hold. But I'm just saying that compared to the rest of his peers here, there clearly is a little bit of a lag in terms of what he produces on a game-to-game basis. As far as the 6.x tier, we have Garnacho rising. I do think, yes, the performance versus Chelsea was poor, but we're not only looking at that. I think Garnacho is someone who, it seems like, at least under Rude, will be playing good minutes. That's only going to be for one game week now, but you do have Leicester at home. And my assumption still is, even if Amram comes in after the international break, that his minutes should be strong. And so far this season, we've seen at least two managers, I feel like, share the same sentiments on someone like Garnacho. And generally, the minutes have been better than Rashford. Now, this could very, very quickly change. But I think when we look at, let's say, the positive traits of Rashford and Garnacho, I do think that Garnacho has had ultimately the better season. Rashford, the only thing really going in his favor is, I think, honestly, a pity penalty from Bruno, but the minutes are slightly worse and he's a bit more expensive. So that's why he's been added to the cheat sheet, but I have so much more faith in Garnacho and his ability to produce. So far, the underlying stats this season has much favored Garnacho, and he's taken a step up as a player, whereas Rashford has pretty much emulated what he did last season, which actually wasn't great because it was, once again, a very poor season if you look at last year for Rashford. As far as Johnson, he clearly isn't at the absolute heights of last season, but we always said that he was someone who's always a little bit tilted towards expected goals. You can clearly see he has a lot of goal threat for a winger, and his minutes actually crucially have been perfect. A point of comparison that I made between Johnson and Kulusevski a couple of weeks ago is that I thought that Johnson would play fewer minutes or be guaranteed less minutes than Kulusevski. Now, this hasn't really been proven to be wrong or right. I think Johnson in the future might get, for example, rotated in some games, not as a starter, but maybe, getting subbed off for someone like Werner, maybe at 80 plus minutes in the game. You can see that, for example, in the EFL Cup, that it's not likely that Johnson will play 90 minutes every single game for the team. There's also European fixtures that obviously allow him an opportunity to get rested. But with Richarlison out of the team, there's actually not that much depth. So I do imagine that someone like Johnson could be playing quite a few minutes in Europe, and then he'll be playing within Ipswich at home. He still seems like, I think, quite a good permanent hold for the long term, because there's not too many people at this sort of price point who can actually offer you consistent value with really good minutes and with that sort of underlying data. And his production this season has clearly taken a step up compared to last. Kulusevski only drops because I do think that he's someone that you hold for the Ipswich at home fixture, but you could probably consider selling him after that, because I do think that there's still slightly better options around the field. And that's sort of my sentiments in terms of ranking all these sorts of players in these price points. In the next tier, we have actually the 7.x million players. I don't really have any changes in thoughts in these players. For Maddison, I think this is arguably, once again, the last week where you'd keep him. It's plausible that he could even get benched in this game, but I don't think it's likely. But as I said a couple of weeks ago, his minutes seem like the absolute worst in the team, and he's a midfielder that I like the absolute least, even though, for example, he scored a great free kick versus Aston Villa. I don't think that's going to change his position in the team, his potential minutes, and how that sort of ceiling is a little bit capped once again. So that's Maddison for you. I do think that Gordon's played really well recently, and Newcastle are about to re-enter a good run of games starting from game week 12. So Nottingham Forest clearly is a poor game in game week 11, but after that, that's a great run of games for Gordon, and I do think that his production this season has taken a little bit of a step up. Clearly, he's not going to be on penalties when Isak is on the field, and Isak seems to be totally fine, totally fit now, so that has a knock-on impact on him, but Gordon's still going to be a stable, decent pick in my opinion. As far as Bruno, he rises towards the top. I think that it is actually quite funny to see the narratives in terms of Bruno and Luis Diaz, particularly going back to the start of the season. And a few game weeks in, we had Luis Diaz, for example, absolutely essential to some managers, whereas I still thought that I was a bit cautious on him. And so far, we've seen Gakpo take a lot of the minutes away from Luis Diaz, whereas someone like Bruno, who does provide sort of permanent quality within a team, is there. I do think that he's been totally underselling his numbers. He himself has missed a lot of key chances in open play. Now, he's a penalty taker, so that's always going to be good value towards Bruno. However, from a sort of expected assist point of view, we know that this United team, unfortunately, have just not been capable of making use of his chances, which I totally appreciate. But you have to imagine that under a new manager, that someone like Bruno can continue to do well. And maybe if the manager can actually produce some level of finishing, I guess, from the amount of good players in theory that United have, I guess Bruno could do well. The reality is, when you have these three fixtures lined up for game weeks 11, 12, and 13, I do think Bruno is an amazing player to own for the next three. Now, Bruno could actually be sold as soon as game week 14, because it's not like the fixtures are, a great run of 5 to 8 games. This is truly a great golden goose run of 3 games in a row, where I think you look at owning these United assets, but you also think about an insurance clause in terms of how do you get out of these assets and how do you plan to structure your team after a short stint owning Bruno. Now, it might be the case that Bruno could still be a season keeper, particularly if Amarin comes in and we're much more enamored by their style of play, the amount of creativity that the team has, and how much they're able to produce right now from an attacking perspective. I still am a little bit pessimistic. Another thing I'll say about Bruno is that even when United have been a much stronger team in the past, his underlying stats were not necessarily much better than they are now. So I can understand why people have still a little bit of a cautious sort of approach towards Bruno, because it's ultimately just about whether his teammates finish his chances and whether he can also finish his chances, which hasn't happened so far this season. But I am still optimistic about Bruno, and I think this is really the time to own him if you have a space in that midfield team. Now, I've been talking about midfield structure for a while, and I myself am in a structure where I own Son and Palmer and Salah, and it's very hard or almost impossible for me to go Bruno. So I clearly have excluded myself from the ability to own Bruno for the time being, but that doesn't mean that that applies to everyone's team. If you have the opportunity to own Bruno, I do think that he's potentially even a higher priority pick than some of the other picks in that sort of 9.x plus category. For Foden, he does get a drop, and ultimately the reality is his minutes have been good, as we've expected, because of the sheer amount of injuries that this Man City team have had. His production has been poor. The underlying stats are still good, though, so they still seem to marry up to what was last season's stats. We know that Foden has always been a sort of clinical finisher, and unfortunately this season, he's just not really been able to sort of hit that gear, which is unfortunate. One thing that I do think that is going to hamper him even more is we know that Kevin De Bruyne is close to coming back towards the squad. There are more winger minutes coming back into the team, with Savinho probably fit for the next game and Doku as well within the squad. So I do think that Foden's minutes will continue to dwindle. And of course, the City fixtures are getting worse and worse. So that's why Foden does drop, regardless of the fact that he's played really good minutes so far and his underlying data has been decent. As far as Saka, Palmer, Salah, no sort of questions on these players. We do have a potential asterisk on Palmer and Son, clearly, because of the scan that Palmer had today. I'm recording this video after the Brentford vs Fulham game, so ultimately we don't know if Palmer is going to be fit, but I think that it seems like the scan is just to make sure that there's actually no sort of lingering damage. I think Palmer should be fine. This is probably the last poor game on paper for Palmer. It's still a home game, which I think is positive when we talk about how to evaluate a fixture, but ultimately I do see Palmer as a bit of a quote-unquote essential pick after game week 12. A lot of people are moving there. He could be a very consistent captaincy option, competing even with the likes of Salah and Haaland, and that's just how good he is. As far as Son and Saka, this is an interesting swing where I personally, for example, own Son, but I would not really be recommending people to necessarily move off of Son or move into Son right now, because still the minutes, as we can see, are being managed, and then the Man City fixture is around the corner. And I think a lot of people also have to ask the question of whether, if you're, let's say, looking at Son, Saka, Palmer, imagining that a lot of people either own Haaland and Salah or a combination of the two, you're not really going to be in a position where you're going to be owning Son plus Saka or really having to make a decision which excludes Palmer. So I do think that it's really a question between Son and Saka. And personally, my intuition is that as soon as game week 12 comes around, I am the type of Son owner who would like to move into Saka, because I do think it's a luxury move, but it is a move that is worth making. And that's sort of my thoughts in terms of Son and Saka this season. Just looking at the baselines of Saka, for example, look at the underlying stats. They're very, very high. We have complete comfort in terms of pen share. He is the younger player as well. He is, however, competing on multiple fronts. So he's also included within these Champions League games, which obviously will probably reduce his minutes. But if you do think that Saka's minutes will remain strong over this winter schedule, I do think that he is probably a better pick than Son for the long term. But that's actually just a little bit of a judgment from me. I can understand why people want to own Son and continue holding Son. That's just sort of my take. If you're a Saka owner, I'd probably hold him, even though there is perceived upside in going towards the Ipswich at home fixture. Now, moving towards the forwards, I haven't made too many changes because I feel like there's no need to be too reactionary within the forward position. I have given Raul a soft drop here because I do think that my concern, generally speaking, with moving into Raul or any of these players within this price bracket is that you still need to be absolutely sure that these players will have great minutes. And I do think that in the December schedule, one of the concerns for certain players, particularly of someone of Raul's age at 33, is that you're dealing with 3 fixtures in a week, and that happens twice in December. And I do think that even though Muniz has not shown anything to really depose Raul from his starting position within the team, and Raul actually does a lot for the team, not just from a sort of goal creation or even goal scoring perspective, he does a lot for defense that probably Muniz doesn't actually add towards the team quite as well. I still think that the minutes can probably be worse after game week 13 plus from this Fulham team. And of course, we're coming off of a good fixture on paper here for game week 10, where he did sort of miss his opportunities, I suppose, versus Brentford at home, which would have been a really, really good game. So when you move off of one of those good games, you do sort of have to adjust. Whereas with Wisa, he's almost entering into a perfect run of games, and he probably becomes a sell later down the line, 13 plus. Strand Larson has an amazing fixture here, but I still think that I probably wouldn't see him as an option that I would hold for the long term. I can understand if people are sort of price pinched. So let's say you wanted to go towards making, let's say, a 2 free transfer move to get towards, let's say, Salah, for example, within the midfield, and you're trying to cut down in terms of budget from some of the strikers that you might have, like a Haaland. I can understand going for Strand Larsen if you're price pinched, but I don't think he's necessarily much better than any of the players at the 6.x price range from an efficiency point of view. So that's why I have Strand Larsen a little bit lower. Evan Nilsson has gone on a rise because we were concerned about the Aston Villa benching, but I still think that over the course of the season, he's probably going to get a decent amount of minutes. And one thing that's really nice for Bournemouth, of course, is that the fixture run becomes so much smoother now that even with, let's say, Evan Nilsson, with Kluivert actually not playing too many minutes per game, you can still arguably say that he could take penalties maybe around 50% of the time just because of minutes. And on top of that, as I said, a very clean run of games. Not someone that you necessarily need to rotate with, but I don't think he's, a permanent hold option either. As far as Welbeck, I think he's actually one of the best picks in the game, but some of the other Brighton commentators that I trust have a little bit of a different insight, and it goes back to that sort of Raul point where with players like João Pedro coming back into the team, with Evan Ferguson, who clearly hasn't really challenged his minutes at all, still around, right, on the substitutes bench for now, Welbeck is someone who probably will lose minutes over December just because of the sort of intensity of the games and what he needs to bring to the table as well, and what Brighton attackers naturally do under Fabian, which is a lot of pressing and a lot of intensity. So that's my concern with him over that sort of future run. And not to mention that the short term is still tough. Man City at home, Bournemouth away are still tough games. Man City, of course, at home seemingly looks easier and easier every single week we watch Man City play this season in 24-25. But that's sort of my thoughts on Welbeck. I do think that he's probably a great transfer in Game Week 13, but we might reevaluate and actually think that João Pedro could be the player to own in Game Week 13. So I do think that if you're, let's say, shopping for a striker and you actually have the ability to maybe delay the decision, Game Week 13 is a good time to potentially wait for the opportunity to bring in the right striker for your team. Because when I look at, for example, a lot of the strikers, almost everyone has a poor Game Week 12 game on paper, except for someone like Raul, which is just how the rotation works. Someone like Welbeck, for example, still has a poor game on paper. Wood, for example, has a poor game on paper. Cunha arguably has a tougher game on paper. So that's sort of the interesting field right now with the strikers, where a lot of people are also looking to rotate with someone like Rodgers, who actually has a good Game Week 12. So you need to think about things like that as well. And that's why certain strikers will actually format or benefit different teams in a different way in FPL, right? So if you own Semenyo, you might actually just want to just choose a striker that you actually want to rotate around Semenyo if you really want to do that. Same with Rodgers, etc. Delap and Vardy do get drops. I do think the fixture run for both is just getting much, much worse. Both decent picks, both probably on penalties in terms of Delap. Vardy clearly is on penalties as long as he's on the field, but ultimately fixtures are fixtures, and I do think that these players have not been really producing too much to guarantee really being anything other than differential over a future run of games that is much poor. Wood and Cunha I still think are my favorite options in the 6.x tier. Højlund is going to be a great differential, but I still think you're also, once again, banking into the element of a non-penalty taking striker, a striker who still needs to sort of raise the level of his underlyings, and that could happen under a new manager, and it could also happen over a great run of games, which is clearly what Man United have over the next 3. Is he a good differential? I think he definitely is. But when we have a lot more comfort over some of the other players and even their minutes, their penalty taking, I do think Wood and Cunha are still better for now. As far as the next tier, I've given Solanke a rise. This might sound like I am sort of overreacting and underreacting to Solanke. I think the reality with Solanke is that, as I said in last week's video, I don't think that he's someone who's going to just be this sort of 0 shots per game type player. Yes, of course, that was a very bad look, and a lot of people can look at that to sort of imply, I guess, how Solanke can be poor in the future. But if you have, for example, 7 games of data of Solanke before he played this great haul of an Aston Villa match, ultimately the numbers were always in between. We know that his pen share is probably, I would say, gone. I feel like Son or Maddison are more likely to take, particularly since Solanke has just scored a brace, so he's definitely not going to get a petty penalty. But Ipswich at home is just that fixture there. The only tough game really is Man City away, and then after that, it's actually a pretty smooth, decent run of games for Solanke, and he, very much like Jackson, is a non-penalty taker, I would say, in my view. So as long as you have confidence in a team like Spurs, who are currently, I think, 2nd or 3rd in terms of team expected goals for now, just being a center forward within that team usually guarantees you opportunities. It's very hard to sort of foresee such an attacking team to have the ability to completely starve their striker and make them a, CDM per se. So that's why I think that This game week was definitely an aberration. The haul was unexpected. That's not the point of, I think, Solanke or the discussion here, but it's just about also we probably shouldn't overreact to a 3-game sample size when we just have more. And sometimes, as I said, the answers are always in between. And it seems like we have a lot more confidence in Solanke now. And that's pretty much the tail of the tape with Solanke. I still think that he rivals Jackson very hard. And ultimately, I think when it comes to game week 12, I still probably would actually prefer going for Isak here. But Isak still has one tough game on paper in Nottingham Forest away. And after that, we can reevaluate some of the forward options on the table. And it also comes down to price points as well. Solanke is cheaper than Jackson, than Isak, than Havertz. And I can understand why people still would like to go for him this week because there's such a good fixture here, even if you have to deal with the swing, which is Man City away after that. As far as Watkins, I do feel a little bit bad about sort of putting him in that sort of differential bracket. I think it's a little bit unfair to him, to be quite honest. And I do think that Watkins will probably rise back to being a yellow option as soon as game week 12 comes around. But I did think that this was a good sort of area or period to sell Watkins. And I do think that's been sort of borne out recently. We also know that he is also playing a lot of Champions League minutes, and that's had an impact overall on him being a 90-minute man as he was last season. So that's going to have a knock-on impact. But the positive, of course, is that his underlying data this season is still very, very strong. It's just the case that without sort of, I guess, certainty on his penalty taking abilities within the squad, which I feel like he's not going to take penalties. And then also just the question mark on his overall minutes in certain games, particularly with, for example, how poorly Aston Villa played when they were sort of exercising Duran plus Watkins in the game versus Spurs. I do feel like both of them are going to challenge for each other's minutes continuously, and it's much less likely, even though I did suggest that it could happen this season, that we'll see a lot more of Watkins plus Duran together, unless they're trying to chase a game, which they technically were versus Spurs, but clearly that was, I think, at a time when they were still level potentially within the game, and that had a significant impact, I think, in terms of how the teams matched up as well. As far as moving on to defense now, we have a lot of changes, but I don't think that these are huge changes within defense. Hall gets reintroduced because I think his minutes have finally been really good, and I finally have a sort of full comfort on his minutes. Nottingham Forest away, obviously a tougher game, but then after that, game week 12 is a generally good run for Newcastle. Anderson, I would still put quite highly just simply because of the price point, and Fulham have actually been a really solid defense. I think if you look at, for example, the Brentford game, yes, of course they conceded, but they literally conceded to a screamer. They actually had very, very few chances conceded, and I still think Fulham are a top quality defense even after the recording of this video. And that Brentford game. As far as Mykolenko, I do think the opposite is sort of on the table for Everton. I think they've actually looked really poor in defense, and something that they were very good at last season was expected goals conceded, and clearly you can see the drop off there. Kirkus has been added because Bournemouth have somehow leveled up in multiple different ways within the team. The attack is very good, the defense is very good too, and Kirkus has actually got a much better minutes, much more consistent minutes this season as well under Bournemouth, and he's been a decent attacking outlet. So not crazy underlying stats like, for example, an Ait-Nouri, a Leif Davis, for example, or even, for example, attacking fullbacks from some of your top teams that we traditionally hold within the top 3. But you can see that there's some value here, more so than other center backs, more so than other fullbacks within the league. So I do think Kirk is a very interesting option. Guehi, just a very consistent option as usual, nothing to say there. Ait-Nouri with a great run of games still, so he clearly is still at the top. And with Aina, I do think the fixtures for Nottingham Forest are getting much worse. Clearly, they are an elite defense, and that's the case. But I've dropped Milenkovic because, as I've always said, I do prefer Aina a little bit just from a sort of bonus points perspective. He scored a goal, which I think was obviously not something you expect from Aina. So I think this 15-pointer clearly was, a surprise, but this happens, right? A lot of defenders can always get crazy hauls. We've seen James Justin with a brace, for example, versus Arsenal. Things like that can happen. Mazraoui has been added, but I still think that there's some concerns overall with sort of his injury proneness potentially. And of course, the question of what Amorim is going to do with players like Mazraoui and Dalot and how they will be impacted. I do think that Mazraoui's minutes probably are a little bit less fragile, or a little bit more fragile, than Dalot's. But a lot of people will also mention that he's played much better this season. I just think that Dalot probably has a bit more permanence within the team in terms of being able to play right center back and right wing back, although Mazraoui clearly also has a lot of flexibility as a player to play in multiple different positions. But I'm less certain about sort of his ability within sort of a sort of wide wing back type position, where ultimately we also know that Amorim has utilized wingers in these sort of fullback or rather wing back type positions. As far as Milenkovic, he drops just to sort of create that separation between him and Aina. And another point that I'll probably mention about Milenkovic, for example, is that I do think this run of games is potentially the stopping point where you want to move off of, let's say, Nottingham Forest defense after the Ipswich at home fixture. Clearly, there's still 2 games to go, Newcastle at home, Ipswich at home as well. But that's sort of the thoughts that I have on Nottingham Forest. They've clearly been elite, but they are generally going to enter a pretty tough run of games. Now, their baselines are really good, and I think we've already tried to adjust to this season within the cheat sheet, with Wood being as good as he has, and the defense being as good as it has. But that's sort of just a reflection of we are still sort of trying to adjust towards fixtures. A team like Aston Villa, for example, have racked up similar amounts of expected goals conceded like a Nottingham Forest. They haven't kept the clean sheets per se, but they are still, for example, going to suffer over a tougher run of games, the same way I think Nottingham Forest would anyways when they have that sort of tougher run of games. As far as, let's say, Lewis and Udogie, they both drop. I just think that, once again, with Romero being a doubt, with Van de Ven being out, unfortunately, the value of a Spurs defender is going to drop a little bit unless you can sort of match in terms of the sort of attacking quality. And unfortunately, Udogie drops here. Lewis with more fragile minutes, which I think will happen. Walker clearly has been absolutely awful, but I think that Pep clearly sees in many games of football, particularly when you look at the games up and coming for Man City, like Brighton, like Tottenham, like Liverpool, that the sort of need to use Walker, I guess, as the anti-transition threat player is there. Lewis can clearly play multiple positions, and he can play in tandem with Walker. We saw that anyways within the Bournemouth game and multiple other games this season, but I do think that his minutes will become more fragile as he also has to play on multiple fronts with the Champions League as well. So that's why Lewis drops, and it's also a reflection of City's tougher fixture schedule. As far as Pinnock and Davis, they also fall just due to fixtures, and ultimately Brentford's defense just being poor. So that's just a reflection of that. And Ipswich, unfortunately, are the worst defense in the league. I do think that Davis, as an owner, for example, the time has come for me to sort of sell someone like Leif Davis, ultimately because the defense is shocking, and I'm not expecting a lot of value from games that are much tougher. As far as Tsimikas, I think it's a differential surely because it seems like he's preferred over Robertson, but how long can that last, and how easy is it for Robertson to maybe get back to starting key games? I think that's very likely. So I still think that Tsimikas is quite a risk, and we know that there's only a short run of games here where you can sort of maximize on Liverpool, probably the next 2 to be honest, and then the fixture run gets a little bit more murkier, and I'm sure Tsimikas and Robertson will probably rotate over this run. As far as Dalot, he gets a rise. I do think this is a good run of games for United, and I'm just reflecting that I think he probably is the safer player in terms of minutes. So that's why Dalot gets a rise, and we know with Amorim coming, hopefully he could even be, I guess, steroided as a player, but it seems also possible that he could just play right center back for the team. As far as, let's say, other changes in the premium players, I've made no changes this week, and that's simply because I still think that the slate is still clean for all these players. Konate seems like he's had a minor injury, so he's fine. Porro, he will actually play, and I think benefit more from Maddison being out, right? Because that just means more set pieces for him potentially. You still have the Ipswich at home fixture. I still see him as an elite pick, even though a lot of people will probably frown at the idea that Porro is seen as elite. Their underlying stats have still been good. And when you look at, for example, and you compare to, let's say, teams like Aston Villa or Nottingham Forest, they're not too far behind in expected goals conceded. So I do think that Spurs have clearly moved the needle on defense. But, you know, in the interim, I can understand people being pessimistic, particularly with the injuries that they have. But he's still so attacking, he's still taking a lot more shots than any other really fullback within the league, outside of probably Trent, that he becomes very exciting still for me. And particularly on games like Ipswich at home, you know, that could be crazy holes potentially for someone of Porro's caliber, as long as things go to plan. And that could happen, just like, for example, Aina lined up for a 15-pointer last week. Guardiola still absolutely class. The fixtures are tougher, so maybe he will drop eventually, but I still think that he's a very, very good pick. And Trent, a lot of people will probably be soured on. I mean, I moved Trent a couple of weeks ago, yellow, and moved him back to green with the fixtures. Clearly, we're coming towards, I guess, the end of another good run of Liverpool fixtures, and he hasn't really maximized on that. One thing I'll mention about this season is that his underlying stats have actually dropped, unfortunately. That is Trent. And it seems like that is probably a reflection of, you know, the different sort of role that he has for this Liverpool team compared to what he was able to do for Klopp rather. So I do think that there is a bit of a sort of movement here in terms of the value of Trent with respect to some of the other Liverpool players, where if the value of Liverpool is purely from the clean sheet perspective, then you can actually access Liverpool defense at a much cheaper price. And maybe Trent isn't necessarily worth 7.0, but I still think he's a very strong pick. I haven't really changed my mind on him. I am clearly someone who moved off of Trent, but I still think that he is very valuable. Even as of last week, I was considering for ways to sort of bring him into my team, but I've sort of cooled off on the idea now because I had sort of more pressing issues in other elements of my squad. But I don't think that You know, someone like Trent is going to be removed from the ability to get nuclear hauls in the future. I still think is a very, very good pick. Someone like Guardiola clearly has gotten a lot of the love lately because he's gotten a lot of the points. But still, I think Trent is probably still the king defender in FPL. As far as the goalkeepers, the only movements that I've really made is to sort of reflect that Fabianski has risen. Areola seems like he might be nursing an injury as well, but I think that could be Fabianski nailed. 4.0 is insane value for a goalkeeper. Flecken drops due to sort of, once again, the underlying stats very consistently basically saying that Brentford have a really poor team. They did manage to get that sort of classic Brentford game where they got a lot of shots saved versus a team like Fulham. But as you can see, when you can see that amount of goals and the bonus points system has changed quite a bit this season, Flecken basically lost 8 points within that game, even though he was on 10 saves. And 10 saves usually probably means good bonus points regardless. And he lost them all because the additional sort of BPS changes this season mean that he probably was removed from 1 to 2 additional bonus points that he would have had last season. And it seems like maybe that's also a reflection of where Flecken is, with the team also playing really poorly on defense from that perspective compared to last season. As far as Pickford, I share the same sentiments there, where I think the defense has clearly dropped in quality compared to last season. So he drops and Onana gets a rise due to the fixture run. And I think he's actually, once again, a very good differential keeper for this run and ahead, expecting, of course, Amorim can improve some things within this United team going forward. So that's going to be the cheat sheet, a little bit of a longer one. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you guys have a wonderful week. Take care. Goodbye, and I'll see you soon.